I was going to say that, yeah, I mean, it's for countries, it's for cities, it's for states, municipalities, corporations. But I want to give an example of how we can apply this and then talk about the positive feedback loop that's created through the first issuance. And I think a good example would probably be Social Security. So if your listeners are listening and they collect Social Security, you might find something really interesting. I did a deep dive research report on Social Security payments. And Social Security payments, the cost of living adjustment is actually based on the Consumer Price Index, CPI. So every single year, the Social Security Fund looks at the CPI to determine the increase in the cost of living adjustment. And that reveals something. It reveals that the government is actually incentivized to understate CPI because they literally save trillions of dollars through the Social
Funny
Security
how that works,
program.
right?
Yeah. So it's a corrupt incentive system. And what's interesting is we have govflation.com, and on govflation.com, we go back to the government's older equation before the CPI used methodology. So this is not like CJ or some type of proprietary equation. This is the government's financed equation back in 1982 before they changed it in 1983. And what's funny, you go to the Social Security website, they skipped the year 1983 because that's when the change was actually made. And they went from a substitution-based index to their a non-substitution-based index to their substitution-based index. And in 1982, the Social Security payment was $419 on average. Well, today, all these years later, after all those cost of living adjustments, today the average Social Security payment is right around $1,800. Well, if the government never changed their CPI methodology, if they kept that same methodology they used in 1982, today the average Social Security payment would be $11,400.
Wow. That's
so
insane.
in 2024 alone, the U.S. government, in 2024 alone, this is not a cumulative number, just in the year 2024 alone, the U.S. government saved $9.5 trillion in 1 year alone by misstating the CPI rate. So they have that incentive. And yeah. I started with that idea because I want people to understand that Bitcoin bonds is not just a benefit to countries and states and cities, but also to different programs that we've promised to pay. So here in the USA, yes, we have $35 trillion in debt, but we have $217 trillion of unfunded liabilities. People forget about that. Yeah. So we're approaching $300 trillion in debt, not $36 trillion in debt, because we made promises to pay all this money, and we're going to have to pay that money or else we're going to have a social breakdown. We're going to have a national emergency because there'll be civil unrest if you take away Social Security or Medicaid or any of these things. So we have to come through on those promises. So one thing that's really interesting that I think is a potential with Trump, but no way with Kamala or the other side right now, is that the United States could collect tariffs in Bitcoin if they wanted to. When Trump made his speech at Bitcoin, he said the United States would become one of the lowest cost energy producers in the world and become a Bitcoin mining powerhouse. So that's really important because we can acquire Bitcoin through mining, and we can acquire Bitcoin through tariffs, and we can acquire Bitcoin through taxes. Well, what do we do with it once we get it? Well, a lot of it you want to keep in your strategic reserve. And the reason you want to do that is because it grows the asset side of your balance sheet faster than your liability side. And that goes back to what you were talking about with El Salvador. The IMF, JP Morgan, the credit rating agencies, they're all being forced to increase the credit score of El Salvador, even though they don't want to do that because they want to point to them and say, look, when you don't take our money, when you don't borrow from us, you're going to die. You're going to descend into living hell. But in reality, El Salvador is blossoming and the economy is thriving. And the asset side of their balance sheet, because of the performance of Bitcoin, is now growing faster than the liability side of their balance sheet, which is forcing the credit agencies to raise their standing. Mm-hmm. And the same thing happens with the Social Security Fund. The Social Security Fund is a separate fund from the U.S. balance sheet. It is its own entity. And the effective interest rate of Social Security in 2023 was 2.4%. So all of the assets that they hold, which is actually just government debt, notes and bonds, which are negative carrying, meaning that the rate of inflation, the real rate of inflation, is above the rate of interest earned. So
Right.
in purchasing power terms, you're buying less at the end of the year, not more. Well, that forces them to continuously raise the full retirement age and to reduce benefits in purchasing power terms. So in other words, the quality of life and the standard of living supplied by Social Security continues to just crater and crash. And if we don't do anything, we're going to end up in a scenario where you can get a wheelbarrow full of cash, but it's not going to buy a loaf of bread. So Bitcoin bonds is also a way that we can integrate Bitcoin into the system in order to come through on some of these promises that we made. Promises that cannot just be, no politician is going to get voted in if they say, well, I'm going to end Social Security. They're just not going to get voted in. We're past that point. So we need innovation. And a Bitcoin bond, the government would issue the Bitcoin bond and the Social Security tax would actually buy the bond. So now the Social Security fund is adding Bitcoin bonds onto the asset side of their balance sheet, not just government bonds. And now these Bitcoin bonds, like I said, the effective rate of the Social Security fund last year was 2.4%. Well, we just walked through a couple examples of what kind of percentage APY we could see from a Bitcoin bond. If the rate of inflation right now is 10%, but a Bitcoin bond is paying 20%, then over those years, you've actually increased your purchasing power 10% year over year. Now we don't need to raise the full retirement age. Now we don't need to reduce the benefits. We could recapitalize the republic. We could make Social Security great again by adopting products like the Bitcoin bond.